I think we're ready to go. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Maria Clara Cobo, and I am Special Projects Manager at Boston Review. I am so lucky to be here with Noam Chomsky, Jim McGovern, Omar Dahi, Alon-lee Green, Sally Abed, and Dr. James Zogby. On behalf of Boston Review and Standing Together, an outstanding peace and social justice organization working to bring together Jews and Arabs, I am delighted to welcome you all to this event discussing the prospects for peace and justice in Israel and Palestine. We at BR are very grateful for Bob Poland, member of our Board of Advisors, who helped us make this discussion possible. We do realize that the timing for this event is difficult for viewers in Israel and Palestine, but please know that we will record the event and post it online at a later date. Our mission at Boston Review is to make democracy better by convening serious discussions on the most fundamental topics. We do it in print with books like Redesigning AI, Thinking in the Pandemic, Climate Action, or our most recent one on uncertainty. We also do it online, and we do it in events like this one. The revenue we get from selling our books and running events helps us fund our programming, but most of our support comes from our members, donors, and charitable grants. If you enjoyed this event tonight, please pop over to our website, bostonreview.net, to enjoy all the free content and consider helping out by becoming a member, making a donation of any size, or buying a book. Omar Dahi will be moderating the event tonight. He is an associate professor of economics at Hampshire College and research associate at the Political Economy Research Institute and the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Omar, with so many thanks to you, Noam, Jim, Alon-lee, Sally, and Dr. Zogby for joining us today, let me hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Maria Clara. Thank you to Boston Review and everyone else involved in organizing this. It is my pleasure to be here, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. I'm an associate professor of economics at Hampshire College, as Maria Clara mentioned, and a research associate at the Political Economy Research Institute. It's really my pleasure to be moderating this event, discussing the prospects for peace and justice in Palestine and Israel with an amazing group of panelists. The importance of the topic of today's panel needs no motivation or underscoring. First and foremost, its importance for the Palestinians inside Palestine and the diaspora, for the Israelis, for the Middle East region, for globally, and also given the special connections for us here in the US to the conflict. This is a struggle that for many of us, myself included, for many of our panelists, and I'm sure many of our audience as well, is one with which we have deep personal connections, as well as longstanding ethical and professional commitments to confronting. So it's really a pleasure to be facilitating a discussion among this panel, who in various ways have dedicated their lives to questions of social justice, human rights, liberation, and peace, whether in Palestine and Israel or elsewhere. Just as the importance of the topic needs no motivation, so too do several of our panelists need no introduction, certainly not for this audience. We're lucky to have such a distinguished lineup. We have with us world-renowned professor, educator, and linguist, Noam Chomsky, Institute Professor at MIT and Laureate Professor at the University of Arizona, Congressman Jim McGovern, member of the House of Representatives, representing the Massachusetts 2nd District, my district here in Amherst, and chair of the House Rules Committee and co-chair of the Tam Lantos Human Rights Commission. We also have Dr. James Zogby, founder and president of the Arab American Institute, who has had a long career in policy research and advocacy. Dr. Zogby was a founding member of the Palestine Human Rights Campaign and the co-founder of the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, and for many years was a member of the executive committee of the Democratic National Committee. You may not be as familiar yet with our two other guests and the organization they represent, but hopefully by the end of the panel today, you'll know a lot more about their efforts and their organization Standing Together, and perhaps find ways to engage their work and support it or similar efforts working for the cause of social justice and peace. The organization Standing Together is a grassroots movement, defines itself as a grassroots people's movement in Israel focused on equality, social justice, and the intersectionality of struggles. We have with us Ms. Sally Abed, member of the elected national leadership, currently acting as the Resource Development and Relations Coordinator in Standing Together. as well as Mr. Alon-lee Green, one of the founding members of Standing Together, an elected member of the national leadership, currently acting as national co-director alongside Rula Dawood. This panel was actually made possible through the efforts of Standing Together, who really are one of the driving forces and co-organizers. And it developed through conversations with the Political Economy Research Institute at UMass and the Boston Review. So I'd like to thank all three of them for organizing this. And I'm honored that I was invited as a moderator as well. The structure of today's event will be as follows. I'll ask each of our panelists to speak for 10 minutes with the same opening question, which is, how do they envision or conceptualize today a meaningful push for the peace process between Palestinians and Israelis? After each of our panelists have gone, we'll do a second round of questions. And of course, I encourage the panelists to respond to one another if they so choose. Meanwhile, please feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A function. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible through the event as time permits. Thank you all, and I really hope you're all as excited as I am to start this. And with that in mind, I'd like to invite Ms. Sally Abed and Mr. Alon-lee Green as our lead co-organizers of today's event to each take 5 minutes to, as you see fit, introduce your organization or yourself and your work and how you as a person or your organization conceptualize the struggle for peace and justice in Palestine and Israel.
Thank you, Omar, so much. And thank you, everyone. What an honor to be here and what an amazing event. Omar really did introduce the movement. I do want to say that we are actually the largest Arab Jewish grassroots movement in Israel, with over 3,200 monthly sustaining members, 13 chapters throughout the country, and tens of thousands of supporter base. In the last 6 years, Standing Together has led major campaigns around issues of peace, equality, social and climate justice, and including the large mobilizations during May, the events in May, which were really a demonstration of the work that we do. But really, before we start talking about Standing Together, I really wanted to present, my experience as a Palestinian living in Israel and why I got to the place that I am in Standing Together and organizing, Jews and Palestinians in Israel. So forgive me if it becomes a little bit too personal, but hopefully it will be worth it. Our experiences as Palestinians and Jews actually living in this tiny place together somehow with aspirations and dreams, frustrations and fears of our inability to buy a home or get a decent job or have a functional transportation, therefore getting stuck in traffic for hours every day. We have struggles as women, as LGBTQ community, as Bedouins in the Naqab, living in unrecognized villages without basic services, Ethiopians suffering from police brutality, as well as ultra-Orthodox Jews and working families, who are working every day from all the groups and still not making a decent living. And the reason that I mention this is because our lives are often overlooked when we talk about peace prospects abroad, and completely overlooked by our government, which is also something that we are trying to fix. So it was important for me to at least present my story. So here I am. My name is Sally Abed. I am originally from the Palestinian village of Ma'alia in the Western Galilee. I am a feminist, I'm a socialist. I pay 36% of my paycheck on rent and bills, and I am considered lucky, and I will never be able to afford a house on my own. My neighbors in Yafa, 9 families, Palestinian families, are currently without a home despite being eligible for public housing. And I have been arrested and beaten up by the police without fault. And I am deeply concerned about our future and the future of my children with the prominent threat of climate change. And yes, I am a Palestinian, and I carry that with me every day, with pain and with pride. The experience of Palestinian citizens in Israel is quite surreal, for the lack of better word. And I think it's a very important one to understand in order to have a better prospect for peace. Between the trauma that we carry from our grandparents, refugee relatives, and continuous and repetitive cycles of violence and wars that affect us as Israeli citizens as well as Palestinians. We have limited to non-existent space to simply exist as Palestinians. We are deprived from our history and our narrative. We cannot speak our language very freely, and we cannot show our symbols, our flag, our narrative, our story. And navigating through this racist and polarizing narrative and society that antagonizes us while trying catching up, because we are statistically less educated and poorer, we try to assimilate on campuses, in workplaces, and in the supermarket in order to manage our lives. And why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because we still somehow manage to create a space with all of this depoliticization, with all this, we are conditioned almost to minimize our story as Palestinians, and somehow we still manage in Israel to create a space that embraces that and is able to actually make something constructive out of it. I did not come here to discourage you. This is a story of hope, I promise. It's important to get that through. I moved to Tel Aviv in 2015 and started working in a startup like many young people here. And I had to work alongside settlers who carried their guns to the office and was called for a hearing when I very, very casually referred to my society as Palestinian society. I felt trapped, unable to act or voice out my opinions. I was unable to act within my limited space. And when I was able to act, I was expected to promote certain ideas within the Israeli left, such as coexistence and equality as an Arab. But there was no more for me, for my aspirations and my life, and feeling part of what I see as a much larger problem. This is what standing together is for me, a political home that gave me the ability to imagine myself as part of a majority. And we are not simply an Arab Jewish movement. We are not seeking coexistence, a state of almost existing in parallel universes with the same space, but not really interacting. Choosing a partnership, refusing coexistence and actually choosing partnership we don't take that lightly. It's actually the most difficult decision. Because we have to navigate a hegemony of Zionist Jewish narrative, controlling this partnership historically within the Arab Jewish partnership in Israel, and hindering a true equal partnership. But demanding one, nonetheless, is either delusional or really a near impossible task. But one thing that I know, which is why I told this story, is that if we, Palestinians and Jews in Israel, did not manage to create this partnership and this space that actually understands that we are part of a bigger picture, and that the interconnectedness of the occupation, the systemic inequality and social injustices are all connected and are actually we would benefit as a majority to actually make a better place for all of us, then I just don't see how we can find a way to imagine freedom for my people and a just peace for everyone that lives here in Israel, Palestine. And one last thing, as a grassroots movement, and this is where I really see the prospect, we are organizing Palestinians and Jews in Israel, and we perhaps face one of the most challenging tasks. We are the ones who are actually trying to navigate the complexities of this partnership, like on the ground. And we attempt to create this new story for a popular left that overcomes the conflicting narratives, or perhaps encompasses them. Now, I'm not saying that we have succeeded completely. but we are relentless, and we are really constantly evolving and innovating through our experiences and through our challenges and the crises that we go through as a society, and more people that come to us, and the more that we actually evolve and innovate. And the fact that we're able to mobilize people around these ideas, especially during very polarizing and violent events in May, that meant to me, and I think it demonstrated to all of us, that we are closer than ever. And I think my point is that we really need to stop overlooking the lives of the people and the peace efforts in Israel, which in my opinion are usually overlooked. That's my take for now.
Thank you so much, Sally. That was great. It was really good to know about this from a personal perspective, but also how you connected to your wider struggles. Alon-lee, did you want to follow up and just give us also your thoughts on this?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Sally. I think when I try to think about the role of our movement in Israel and in the area of Israel and Palestine, I really think of us as an actor that is a key element in organizing people in Israel, in the Israeli society, are Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jewish citizens of Israel. And we do so because we understand that without us being an active actor on the ground, without us connecting the struggles of daily needs of people's life, without us connecting the struggle for social justice, for environmental justice, for equality of all kinds of inequality in Israel, to the struggle against the occupation and for an Israeli-Palestinian peace, we will just be, people that will be very moral. We will be able to say the occupation is bad and that racism is not good and it's immoral. And we will be saying that, there's a lot of human rights violations in the West Bank and in Gaza, and that we condemn this reality. But I think we will not be able to change this reality. And standing together as a grassroots movement exists in order to change the reality, not only to condemn it and to say it's bad. And the way we try to do that is to organize and mobilize people, and to connect communities and to connect people and bring them together in the different struggles, and also seeing why those struggles are connected. We in Israel also suffer from our government. A lot of times when you look from outside around the world on Israel and Palestine, you can say Israel is the bad, part. Israel is the occupying country of Palestinians, and that's of course true. There is occupation. The equation is not equal in both sides, but identifying the Israeli government and Israel with the Israeli people, I think that's a very big mistake, because we are a society as any other society. We have our disparities, we have our needs, we have our hopes, we have our struggles, and our government is not a good government for us as a people here in Israel, Arab Palestinians and Jews. And what we're trying to do is to ask the very fundamental question of how to build a majority in Israel, and connect the different parts of the society into a majority, claiming that we do not benefit from the occupation, we do not benefit from the extreme right-wing populism in Israel, and that there's only a small minority in Israel that really benefit from the current reality, and that will try to preserve it as hard as they can. And what we try to do is also to engage in different kind of struggles, such as the struggle for minimum 40, the minimum wage campaign we have right now to raise the minimum wage in Israel, something that we find relevant for almost everyone living in our country. But again, a small minority that is kind of happy with the reality as it is. And we try to connect this struggle with the struggle against house demolitions in East Jerusalem, and with the struggle of acknowledging unrecognized villages in the Negev. And we do find that it's very challenging. We're not here to sell you like a false story. We are hopeful. Yes, we have optimism. We believe, our movement slogan is where there's struggle, there is hope, and there is struggle in Israel. But we don't want to, sell you a false story that everything is good. Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel for the past 12 years, have left a few months ago. But just a minute before he left, we had another war. This war was another eruption of violence. It was scary to go in the street. If you're Arab, speaking Arabic, you could get lynched. It was scary to go as a Jewish person in Jerusalem, and then you can get stabbed and attacked. It was scary to live in the south of Israel, having missiles falling on your house, and it was scary to live in Gaza, having missiles on your house and no shelter to run to. And this reality, we saw how it escalates so quickly. And we did have a promise in Israel that we're going to have a changed government. But is it really a changed government? Is this government stopped building or approving new housing in settlements in the West Bank? No. Is this government trying to look at the situation and understand that there is a root cause for the violence in this area, and this is the occupation? No. Is this government, even though it has left parties, the Jewish left parties partnered in this government, is it a government that is trying to create a deep change in the relations of the government, of the state, to the Arab Palestinian minority in Israel? We don't see that yet. So we do understand that our role in this moment is to keep pushing and to keep fighting and to keep organizing on the ground and connecting the different struggles into what we try to speak of an alternative of social justice, of equality, of a just peace. And I do want to just end in one more note. And it's something that kind of bothered me, and even we felt very isolated in last May when the war erupted and we had this violent escalation. We really did, as Sally said, felt overlooked. We felt that all across the world, people, politicians, government condemn Israel. Sometimes, even in the progressive politics in the US, a lot of social media status says Israel is an apartheid state. I don't know. It's not my role to disagree or to argue with that. Israel is all this. It looked like Israel became this blur of fascism, racism, and that there was no Israeli society. And we felt that this part that we try to represent of a struggle on the ground, a Jewish Arab, very hopeful struggle on the ground for ending the occupation, for trying to build a majority in our society was strongly overlooked. And we felt that it is, that we cannot trust as people that are also, victims of the reality here, victim of the violence. We cannot trust the UN or the US president to just wake up one day and to say, today I decide to, bring peace upon Palestine and Israel and to end the occupation. We feel that, we have no hope that someone will just, one day do that. We need to do that with our partners in the West Bank and in Gaza. We need to do it with our partners here in the Israeli society. And it's upon us to organize and to create this moment of a big wave of struggle and optimism. And I think that maybe this message of us existing as a society that struggles for justice is a message that can be heard tonight. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alon-lee, for sharing these thoughts. And I'm sure we'll have a chance to get back again at some of these questions later on in the discussion. With that, I'd like to turn to Professor Noam Chomsky. Noam, this is the week of your birthday. Happy birthday again. And I guess it's as good a week as any to ask you about this, given your lifelong commitment to the struggle in your writing and your activism and your speaking. Help us conceptualize this. How would you conceptualize a meaningful push in the peace process today? What would it take? What are the elements? What kind of obstacles might it have to overcome?
Well, to begin with, these are the voices that we've just heard that are the hope for some positive outcome to the struggle for peace. And the best thing we can do is to try to reinforce their voices from our own positions. But let me just say a couple of words about what the general terrain looks like to me, then a few more comments. First of all, as was pointed out, there are two different, though closely interrelated, struggles. One is internally to Israel within its legitimate borders. That's a struggle for civil rights, human rights, hard struggle, plenty of harsh developments taking place, some mentioned, others that weren't mentioned but are very serious. You can read in this morning's Israeli press about the fact that there was an agreement, there was a judgment by the High Court 6 months ago that permitted conversions to Judaism, which means full citizenship, by people who are converted by conservative reform rabbis. It's not been implemented. The Haredi Orthodox Jewish community is too powerful to allow implementation of it, apart from tiny fragments. A plan even to allow non-Orthodox Jews to have a special place to pray at the Wailing Wall was blocked once again, though it's been authorized by the courts for a long time. These are among the many problems developing internal to Israel, not even in this case, including just within the Jewish community in Israel, plenty of problems like many other countries. The other major issue is the issue of the occupation. If we take a look at that, I think it's often described in a way which is somewhat misleading. The options that are discussed typically are two. One is the long-standing international consensus on a two-state settlement on the international border with minor and mutual modifications. That's the official US terminology up to through the 1970s. And that's become overwhelming international consensus since then. So that's one option. The other option, which is increasingly discussed, is what's called a one-state settlement, a single state, including the occupied territories in Israel. That's posed now as the alternative. Whatever one thinks about these alternatives, they're overlooking a third alternative. In fact, the one that is in fact being implemented, and we should certainly consider that one. The fact is that systematically, since the June 67 war, Israel has been pursuing a policy, planned, careful, systematic policy of essentially taking over whatever is of value to it in the occupied territories and integrating it within Israel. That means for the West Bank, taking over what's called Jerusalem, which is a vastly expanded area, about 5 times the size of historic Jerusalem, taking in many Arab villages, was annexed by Israel in violation of Security Council orders, including the United States at the time, back in 1968. It's virtually annexed. That includes the Golan Heights, also illegally annexed by Israel in violation of Security Council, unanimous Security Council orders. includes the Jordan Valley, about a third of the land of the arable land of the West Bank. The Palestinian population has been systematically removed by one means or another, devious means, establish a military firing zone or a green zone, and remove the population. And after a couple of years, you find a Jewish settlement expanding and so on. These are various devices which have effectively removed a large majority of the population of the Jordan Valley, and others are under constant attack. A couple of weeks ago, the IDF entered one village, destroyed the solar panels that had been provided to them by an Italian NGO. Maybe Europe will again provide something, it'll then be ruined. But these things happen every day, literally. If you read, say, Haaretz, you can see daily reports of something of this sort throughout the West Bank. So take over the Jordan Valley, take over the Jerusalem, take over salients going to the east of Jerusalem, basically bisecting what's left of the West Bank. One of them from Jerusalem goes to the town of Ma'ale Adumim, which is established mostly under the Clinton years. Another one to the north to Ariel, basically bisecting what's left. Another one in Kadumim. What's left to the Palestinians is the areas of dense population concentration. Israel doesn't want those. So it's not taking over Nablus. It's not taking over Tulkarm. Those are to be left isolated to the Palestinians, survive some way that they can. As in other, essentially, neo-colonial systems, there's a place left for the Palestinian elites. That's Ramallah. So if you are in Ramallah, it's like a European city, theaters, concerts, restaurants, nice place to live for the elite, like any Central African country under, say, French rule. There's a place for the elites. What's left in the 60% of the West Bank that Israel basically takes over is scattered villages. There are now, I think, 165 enclaves where Palestinian village survives, surrounded by checkpoints, IDF soldiers, subject to constant attack by settlers, with the Israeli army watching. People are randomly stopped from going to their crops or their olive groves if they're not, which are under attack by settlers. It's basically make life unviable. It's they're not being killed, but they can survive, but an unviable existence. And all of this is the areas of Jewish settlement, like Ma'ale Adumim, Ariel has a university, and so on. These are integrated into Israel with a high-class infrastructure projects. You can travel from your subsidized suburban home in Ma'ale Adumim to your job in Tel Aviv and not know that an Arab exists. Many young Israelis don't even know that the border, the Green Line, it's all kind of getting integrated into a greater Israel, which sooner or later will be moved from integration to annexation. That's the third option. The actual one, the one that is being systematically developed, has been through all governments with very little change, basically for about 50 years. So there are three options. One is Greater Israel, the actual one that's being, I haven't talked about Gaza, which has just been turned into a monstrosity after the Israeli settlers were removed in 2005. It's been living on what Israeli authorities called a diet, just enough to survive, nothing more than that, constant, irregular Israeli attacks. There's no more, the water is almost completely poisoned. sewage systems destroyed, power systems destroyed, constant attacks of what Israel calls mowing the lawn, where hundreds, thousands of people are killed. The farmers are killed regularly if they are moving too close to the border. It's a virtually unlivable prison camp. That's Gaza. Well, that's the third option, the one that exists. And it exists because the United States supports it. That's the simple fact. Back in the mid-70s, there were Security Council proposals, Security Council resolutions calling for a two-state settlement on the international border, with guarantees for I'm quoting, guarantees for the right of each state, Israel and Palestine, each the right to exist within secure and recognized borders. That was the resolution supported by Syria, Egypt, Jordan, so-called confrontation states, tacitly supported by the PLO at the time, more openly later, vetoed by the United States, initiating a history which is no time to run through, but essentially like this, one where, in fact, sometimes the vetoes, usually it's shifted over to the General Assembly since the Security Council was largely eliminated by the US veto, where almost annually there are votes of a similar sort with numbers like 150 to 2 or something like that, with similar content. Well, that's pretty much the situation that's evolved. There have been other changes in Israel and in the United States. In the United States, the major change, very striking in the last 20 years or so, is a major shift of public opinion. I've seen it in my own experience. Up until about 15 years ago, if I was giving a talk on a college campus, including my own campus, MIT, on Israel-Palestine, I had to have police protection because the meetings would be broken up. Police would insist on accompanying me back to my car. Sometimes on another campus, I'd have to have police accompanying me the whole time I'm on campus if there was one talk on Israel-Palestine. That's totally changed. I think what largely changed it is the attacks on Gaza. You could really see it change radically every time there was a major assault on Gaza. First Cast Lead, 2008-9, then the others. And what's happened over the recent years, shown very clearly by polls, is that the more liberal parts of US society have shifted substantially towards more support for Palestinian rights. It's particularly true among younger people, including younger Jews, incidentally. The popular base for support for Israel used to be liberal Democrats. That's changed substantially. The popular base for Israel now is the far right, the evangelical community, which has its own story about they could be dedicated anti-Semites, but support Israeli policies for their own reasons. Military and security sectors, Israel's strong point. They're closely supportive of Israel, and the ultra-nationalist right. It's a huge change. It's a change that hasn't really affected policy much, but sooner or later it will. It's a functioning democratic society. Popular opinion can't be suppressed forever. So that does offer options for the future. I think there are possibilities for solidarity between Americans committed to Palestinian rights and groups like yours in Israel-Palestine, which can work together to overcome the imposition of the Greater Israel program, which is now in process. And I think that's the real hope for the future. And I think there are possibilities there that can be realized.
Thank you so much, Noam. Congressman McGovern, thank you again for joining us today. It's really great that you can take the time to be with us and give us a chance to hear your thoughts about this. So I guess I would like to ask you the same opening question in terms of your thoughts about this as someone with longstanding commitment to human rights, your co-chairing of the Human Rights Commission, and someone who's really weighed in perhaps in various moments on this topic. But what would it take now in terms of the U.S. For conceptualizing a push on this peace process?
Well, thank you, Omar. Thank you, and Noam, thank you, and Jim Zogby, and I want to thank my friend Bob Poland and the Boston Review and Standing Together, and thank you, Sally and Alon-lee, for your opening remarks. I mean, my expertise, if I have anything that I'm expert in, is mostly kind of Latin American policy. But the one thing I want to begin with is that in all the years I've worked on peace building and on promoting social justice movements, the one thing I've learned is that the resolutions, the ideas, can't be dictated to from outside. That grassroots organizing within regions and countries, those are the things that are important. Those are the things that are lasting, and those are the things that we have to figure out whether we can be wind at your back. So to Sally and Alon-lee, I appreciate the work that you're doing, which is really, really difficult. And I think one of the challenges that we have in Congress, I mean, Noam says that more and more people are thinking differently about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but what I sense here in Washington, I'm just going to be very honest with you, is more polarization. And I especially on this topic, that no matter what you say or do, you're either all right or you're all wrong, depending on the perspective. And my first job in Washington was as an intern for Senator George McGovern. I'm no relation, but I thought he had a great last name, so I decided I was going to work with him. And I remember I asked him one time, why he would have breakfast with people like Barry Goldwater, or lunch with people like Bob Dole. I said, well, why would you do that? And he used to say to me, you don't have to agree on everything to agree on something. And the something that we agree on, we got to come together on. Because Barry Goldwater wants to quadruple the military budget. He says, I think he's nuts. He says, I want to cut the military budget. He thinks I'm nuts. But you know what? We represent agricultural states, and we have farmers, and we can come together to help our farmers. We have some small businesses that we represent. We can come together, and we can help represent them, and we'll fight about the other stuff. But I worry sometimes that, especially in the United States at this moment, that it is more and more difficult to come together on what we agree on, no matter how small or how big, and move that forward unless we agree on everything. And so that is a challenge that we have here, and we have to figure out how to deal with it. I have focused a lot of attention on human rights, on the suffering of the Palestinian people, also on the challenges that Israel faces. And I think Alon-lee and Sally, pointed out that oftentimes when we talk about these issues, we talk about them in generalizations. If you don't like the Israeli government, we assume that all the people in Israel feel the same way. If there's something, that we don't like that's happening within the Palestinian territories, we assume everybody falls into the same category. I mean, people are complicated. Countries are complicated, and I think there needs to be a better appreciation of that here in Washington. I really appreciate some of the stuff that Standing Together has focused on, which seems a lot of bread and butter issues, finding common ground on whether it's housing or other kind of social justice issues that you can build consensus and start building trust and start building a movement. And I think we need to learn more about what you're doing here in the United States Congress, because I think it's a way, to have, a more thorough discussion as to how we move forward. And even if we don't agree on everything, where are the areas we do agree that we can actually make a difference and actually help people? And, I talked earlier about polarization, and I'll give you a couple of examples. J Street recently had a congressional delegation with some very progressive members who visited Israel, including a new freshman from New York, Jamal Bowman. Barbara Lee was on that trip as well. When they returned to the United States, they were pretty heavily criticized for their trip. They met with all different perspectives. Sally, you met with, right? And yet he got heavily criticized for meeting with the Prime Minister of Israel, and nobody really at the time, nobody really knew what he said, but the pushback was kind of jarring. I'll give you another example. I co-chair the Human Rights Commission. I really believe that we need to do all we can to protect human rights organizations, because I think that's a check, that's accountability that needs to be protected. I sent a letter to Secretary of State Tony Blinken criticizing the Israeli government for listing 6 Palestinian human rights organizations as terrorists. And by the way, I checked with the UN Rapporteur on Human Rights. I checked with the State Department beforehand, just say, am I missing something? And I waited, I was missing something. Most of the feedback I got from kind of pro-Israel forces was pretty hostile. And I'll give you an exception though. The Jewish Federation actually in central Massachusetts that called me, we had a very productive conversation. But as I said to them, I consider myself a friend of Israel. I always have. But friends can be critics. And if you're my friend and you're doing something that I just of a friend, and I point out those 2 examples because here in Washington, and again, I'm not saying that this is the way it should be. I'm just saying it's the way it is politicians tend to not want to gravitate toward issues that are polarizing or that engender the wrath of whatever constituency is out there. And I worry that sometimes the reaction to condemn or to cancel results in people not wanting to deal with the topic, to avoid the topic. So if we're going to try to get Congress to and Washington to be more engaged and more focused and more constructive on these issues and more open to listening to different sides and potentially moving in different directions, I think we have to understand that not everybody agrees on everything. And we have to understand that nuance. I think, Sally and Alon-lee, I think you do, but we need more of that here. We need more candid conversations. We ought to have conversations with people who represent, very, very strong pro-Israeli government views, at the table. Because quite frankly, we need to find out whether there's any common ground at all on any of this stuff. And so I guess what I'm saying here is that we need to figure out a pathway forward that includes creating the political space here in the United States where we can have intelligent, rational conversations, knowing that we may not all agree on the same things. Because if everybody could agree, for example, that the human rights organizations that were listed by Israel should not be listed as terrorists. I mean, is it possible to bring people from all sides together and say, you know what, no, this is a bad precedent, this is a bad example? Because if you do it, by the way, other countries around the world are doing it as well, and it's all about, stifling dissent. And, if we could agree on, when those on the Palestinian side do things that we all know are wrong, then, if we could agree on that, maybe there could be some basis for coming together. Again, I mean, I think, the stuff that Alon and Sally are talking about, more the bread and butter issues, I think probably are the better ways to start. If we could all agree on housing, for example, and we agree on, certain basic, rights for people, maybe that's a better way to start. But I do think that that's a challenge here, and we need more people to be engaged. I think the administration is more likely to be engaged if they think that there is benefit at the end of the road. That in fact, that even if they don't fulfill the desires and goals of whatever side or whatever perspective, that in fact, that there's value to trying to move the ball forward, even a little bit. So I'm, look, I mean, parliaments and Congresses, are political institutions. The one thing that every member of Congress cares deeply about, is making sure that everybody's happy in their district. And if you begin to start talking about things that engender, great passion and strong objections from whoever, if you feel that just by raising issues that you're going to find yourself in an untenable situation, the tendency to look someplace else. And I think we need to figure out a way to re-engage thoughtful politicians on all perspectives, bringing them to the table to see whether there's anything, no matter how small, that we can agree on. And if we agree on those things, we can start building confidence. If we can start talking to one another, then maybe we won't demonize one another as much. We won't dehumanize one side or the other side or whatever. I hate to say in terms of sides, because again, that implies that everything is black and white. It's not. Life is not that way. Life is very, very gray, and we have to account for that. But I will tell you, and I'll close with this. One of the most memorable meetings that I think I've had ever in my office was with a Palestinian mother and an Israeli mother, both who lost their sons in this conflict. And they sat here in tears and told me the enormity of their loss. And the Palestinian mother, her pain was as great as the Israeli mother. And when their sons were taken from them, their first impulse was one of rage, but then they realized that that's just a waste of time. They didn't want any other Israeli or Palestinian mothers to have to deal with what they dealt with. And so they came to Congress to tell us that we need to start approaching this subject very differently. And we need to start looking at the people and not just at governments or leaders, but at people, that human beings, Palestinians and Israelis are human beings. And we ought to approach the topic and the subject with that in mind. And so I always try to struggle with what the right thing to do is. I would be lying to you if I told you that I knew what the magic formula was to make everything the way we all want it to be. Again, I really am impressed by the work that Sally and Alon-lee are doing, and I want to thank you again for that, because that's hopeful to me, that you're bringing people together who otherwise would not be together. I mean, that's how you build movements, and I hope that we can continue to work together. And I'd love to know more about the work and maybe figure out ways that we can be of help here in Washington. But I think I'd like to think that maybe that's a basis where we can bring people of very divergent points of view together, because at the end of the day, this is not about giving speeches. It's about making a difference. It's about getting results and bringing people together who normally don't come to the table. I know it's easier said than done. I mean, Jim Zogby has been in my office. He's been in other offices, forever. And I respect always his approach and the way he tries to bring people together up here. But I appreciate the opportunity to be on this conversation. I've already learned a lot, and I again thank you for having me. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congressman. And I'm perhaps I'd have a chance to follow up with you actually on the letter that you wrote to Secretary Blinken at some point and see if there's been any response or any movement on that front. But now I'd like to turn to Dr. Zogby. Thank you for waiting patiently through this discussion, and I'd really like to hear your thoughts. You've basically worked on this nonstop since the 1970s, I believe, or perhaps earlier, as well as other issues for Arab American rights as well. And what are your thoughts on this today? Are you hopeful?
Well, thank you. I'm always hopeful. I'm always hopeful because I believe that we as a species, despite the appearance of setbacks, continue to grow in consciousness and compassion. Noam referred to the polling issue and pointed to Gaza. I think that's part of it, Noam, but I think the reason why there's fundamental change occurring, especially among young people and people of color, is a growing consciousness, an awareness of the world. My favorite theologian was Teilhard de Chardin, who had this vision of expanding consciousness, bringing people together, and compassion, being compassionate toward each other. The reality is suffering's always existed in the world. There have always been massacres. There have always been tribes demolishing and exterminating other tribes, et cetera. We just know it more today. So we think the world is in worse situation. It's not. It's just we know more about it. I mean, we have young kids on college campuses organizing around Darfur that 20 years ago people didn't know where it existed, or about the Rohingya didn't know they existed, or the Uyghurs today that nobody knew existed. We know it and we act on it. We have a responsibility, and that is what is defining us and defining this era. And I'm hopeful because I see it growing and changing every single day. But with all due respect to Alon-lee, and I appreciated your comments. Sally, when I was listening to you, I was thinking of something that I'd heard back when I first got into this in 1971. I went to the refugee camps in Lebanon to research my doctoral dissertation. I was working in a combined anthropology religion program on the change in consciousness that exists among people who live with stress. And my advisor at the time said, I was going to work with groups here in the States. He said, no, everybody's writing about them. Work with Palestinians. No one's ever written about them before. This was the beginning of my odyssey, this path that I was on. So off I went, my wife and I and our year-old baby, to the refugee camps in Lebanon. And I diligently took stories. I wrote them in my notebook, collected the stories of so many people, and then went back to Beirut and sat with Ghassan Kanafani, the famed Palestinian novelist, to tell him about what I was doing and to ask his advice. And he said, tell me again a little more what you're doing. I said, I'm looking for where evidence of the radical change in consciousness that exists among Palestinians because of the stress they've lived under. He said, oh, you're in the wrong place. He said, in the camps, people froze the past. They're living with a romanticized past. They've recreated the village in the camp. He said, the place where revolutionary, creative thinking is taking place is among the Palestinian citizens in Israel. He used the expression, they live in the belly of the beast. They've absorbed from the oppressor and they've taken the symbols of the oppressor and turned them into radical thinking. So through them, I met Tawfiq Zayed and Mahmoud Darwish and Samir Qasim, and I read, Job's diary, and I read them talking about Jeremiah speaking to the city. I mean, they absorbed the language of Israel and used it against Israel like Langston Hughes did. Where do you find the soul? Like W.B. Du Bois talked about the souls of Black folk. Where do you find the soul of America? You find it he said, in the hearts and in the speech of Black America. And I believe ultimately that when I see Aida Tuma Suleiman and I see Ayman Oda and I see you now, Sally, I say this is the future of Palestinian thinking. It's not with the guys in Ramallah. It's not. They're stuck. It's not in the camps. They're stuck. It's with young, creative people in the West Bank, to be sure, also in the Palestinian citizens in Israel. So I thank you. You and Alon are doing great work, and I appreciate that. That said, I want to talk a little about the topic at hand, because a little story. I went to see Congressman McGovern because I was working on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I was appointed for 4 years to the commission. And I bided I knew the ADL had opposed my getting the post. They said, all he wants to do is just talk about Israel. Well, I didn't. Every year we voted on condemning 27 countries for their violations of religious freedom, et cetera. But in the last year, we had worked with a group of lawyers in the West Bank who put together a magnificent little book on Israel's violations of religious freedom of Christians, Muslims, and non-Orthodox Jews. It was fairly comprehensive. And we went to the commission, myself and another colleague, another Democratic appointee, who was also one of the leaders in a major Jewish organization, was very progressive. And we said, we should have a discussion about Israel's violations of religious freedom. All hell broke loose. Why are you doing this? Why are you singling Israel out for criticism? I said, every year we vote on 27 countries and I vote with you. I'm not singling it out for criticism. You're singling it out as the one country that can't be criticized. And as a result of that, you are creating a sense of impunity that we will never be criticized. And therefore we can do whatever we want to do. And so I would differ with the view, Congressman, that external pressure can't be used, because I believe that the reason why the debate in Israel is so radically skewed, true, that as well, skewed toward the right, is because they have been the beneficiaries of literally uncritical US assistance now for 2 generations. I went with President Clinton to Bethlehem in 1998. He had put his foot down a year earlier about what Israel calls Har Hama, what the Palestinians call Jabal Abu Ghneim. Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. It blocks Bethlehem from Jerusalem, don't do it. And we were there and we saw the bulldozers beginning to go. Today, there's 20-something thousand people in Har Hama. We would say don't do it, and they do it. My argument with the Biden administration so far to date has been, your platform calls for equal worth of Palestinian lives and Israeli lives, and their equal value, and opposing settlements, opposing annexation. But when we ask them to put conditions on US assistance, they said, no, that's the red line. We can't cross that line. I said, if you don't put that in, then equal worth of life won't matter. That Israel will not respect equal worth of Palestinian lives. If you don't put it in, settlements will expand. If you don't put it in, creeping annexation will continue. And that's the reality. And so I don't talk about a peace process anymore, because I don't think there is one. I mean, it was a sort of a cruel joke at some point that Dennis Ross, a sort of path he took us down, that as folks used to say, was all process but no peace. I mean, that was never there. It was a kind of an endless sort of game within a game within a game of compromise within compromise with no end in sight, because we would never use pressure. We would never put our foot down and say, enough is enough, stop here. I mean, how do you go from Oslo to the first decade and see settlements double? And then today, settlements have tripled from where they were. And as Noam clearly pointed out, it's difficult even to imagine how you construct a Palestinian state, given the obscene creeping annexation that's taken place. And what it's done to daily life in the West Bank is devastating. Rajesh has a wonderful little book about that he used to go for walks. And he always grew up going for walks, and now he can't go for walks because any place he walks, he runs into checkpoints or soldiers or settlers who will harass and threaten him. They have been confined into, not Gaza's a big prison, these are little prisons. Marvelous piece by Nathan Thrall in the New York Review of Books, where he describes the death of a young child on a bus that was on a dangerous road. He was on the road because the bus wasn't allowed on the main road. It had to go through this convoluted path to go from a place that should have been 5 minutes away, took much longer than that and was dangerous. And the child died. And Thrall not only lays out that, but lays out the entire story of how Palestinians who live in this area that Israel calls Jerusalem, but is 28 villages that have been engulfed by settlements. The Israelis now call the Palestinian villages neighborhoods. They're not, they're separate villages. But the reality is that daily life has become a nightmare for people. And I think that that's where my starting point is. When I started the Palestine Human Rights Campaign back in the 70s, we decided rather deliberately that we would not talk about statehood. We wouldn't talk about solutions. We would focus on individual stories of people and win support for the stories. We took mayors who'd been expelled. We took college president who'd been expelled. We took people who had been tortured. We took people who had been had their homes demolished. Individual stories, and we told them. And the reason why I took that route was because as I understood the issue when I came back from the refugee camps and I started speaking to audiences, people were like, what are you talking about? Some people would be outraged. And a friend of mine said, I said, why were they outraged? He said, because you did something that was scary to them. You humanized a people that they had learned were demons or were simply objects that didn't exist as real live people. And so I used to say it this way. I used to say, in the American mind, it was Israeli people versus the Palestine problem. How do we solve the problem so that people can have peace? And when it's framed that way, people will always side with the, with the Israeli people because they can feel them, they see them, they know them. Israelis die. Newspaper story includes the name, interviews the parents, feels compassion for the lost. Palestinians are a number. This many Palestinians died. New York Times this year, for the first time, put all the pictures of the people who were killed in the Gaza campaign. That was huge. They only did it because Haaretz had done it earlier, but it was a breakthrough that Americans can see these are real people. And so unless we humanize the Palestinian side of the equation, people aren't going to come to the right conclusion. The reason why young people today are moving is because they have alternative media sources and they're seeing those stories and those pictures. And so I really feel that efforts underway to tell the story, to condition US assistance to minimal guarantees of human rights. I mean, there are things happening in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in Gaza, that if they'd happened to any other people anywhere, Congress would be moving, the president would be speaking, but we don't. And when we do, it's why you're singling Israel out for criticism, which is in effect a very racist comment to make. What it's saying is that Palestinian lives are not equal, that they're not worth defending. The Palestinians expelled from their homes or whose homes are being demolished or whose lands are being taken from them, they're not equal in worth. I mean, right now we go to the Biden administration, we complain about they're building a settlement here, they're building a settlement there, they're doing this, they're doing that. They say, yeah, but we can't criticize because we're really nervous and make public criticism will weaken that Israeli government. Pardon me for saying it, but that's racist. What that says is that our concern for the internal politics in Israel takes precedence over defending the rights of individual people. Those people aren't worth it to us. And that's, I cannot abide that. So you ask me, how do we advance peace with justice? It's by focusing on justice, by focusing on human rights, by elevating cases and calling for the very same treatment for Israel and what it's doing to individual people, to communities, that we would do to any other country doing the same thing. In the first place, we would not be giving them unquestioned military assistance. We would not be giving them unquestioned support at the United Nations. We would not be merely abstaining and thinking that's a big victory instead of voting with the rest of the international community. By the way, there was a vote in the UN the other day. I've always felt that there was a need for a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East. I mean, nobody should have nuclear weapons because, frankly, it's stupid. When you have one, you can never use it because 5 minutes later, you're dead. I mean, if Israel used a bomb on Iran, who would die? Everybody in the whole freaking region would die from the nuclear fallout, right? From the radiation. If Iran used a bomb on Israel, they'd kill more Palestinians than anything because they had nowhere to run or hide or seek shelter. And the Lebanese and Syrians and Jordanians as well would go. I mean, it's irrational to even conceive of it. But we focus all of our energies on that and no energy on the real issues of what are happening to people right now today. And as a result of that, we've created kind of a, I call it an abused child and a spoiled child syndrome. The Israelis feel I can do anything I want, never going to get punished for it. So why not just keep doing it? Because they tell me, don't do it. We do it and nothing happens. The Palestinians have become the abused child and their behavior has become as distorted as well because they can never do anything right. So why not just keep doing it and acting out? The distortions on both sides would be corrected if our policy changed and we measured human rights by a single yardstick. We would have authority when we say to the Palestinians, don't do this. And they wouldn't be able to say to us, but why don't you say anything to Israel? And the Israeli left and the peace forces and groups like Alon-lee and Sally's would be strengthened if we condemned Israel's behavior, because they would be able to say in their own society, you see, you cannot keep getting away with this. We've got to have a debate here about how our government functions. But we weaken progressives, we weaken the possibility of a debate in both societies when we're silent or when we only use a yardstick one way. Congress has taken so many measures sanctioning, punishing Palestinians. Palestinian aid is the most encumbered aid program that we have. Israel's aid program and support is the least encumbered program we have. We have to balance that out a little bit. And so I commend you for what you're doing. I thank you for the leadership you demonstrate, but I know that what we need to do to help you is to speak more clearly and with more force, the force of conviction that human rights exist for everyone, measured by one yardstick and treated by us the same way for everybody who violates those rights. And so, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Zogby. I think you were about to mention the UN General Assembly vote.
Oh yeah, 178 to 1. It was 178 to 1. The US abstained, big deal. It was to create a nuclear-free zone. Israel was the only one to vote against it. And the Cameroon and the US were the two who abstained, which I don't know what the Cameroon, what their situation is, but
thank you.
But I wonder why or how we think our negotiating stance vis-a-vis Iran is strengthened by us abstaining on that. Anyway, it's bizarre. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to go back to Sally and Alon-lee if you had any follow-ups, but before I do, I wanted to remind everyone that you could post your questions in the chat function as you're listening. I think please go ahead and do so anytime, and we'll get to them as soon as possible. But Sally, Alon-lee, you've heard a lot, and do you have any follow-up comments or any thoughts about what you've heard, or just any responses?
You want to start, or should I? Okay. Well, first of all, thank you all. I put so many notes just reacting to everything that was said. Usually when I give these things, you know, and I talk about our work, it's you know, we just want to make it sure, you know, the Arab-Jewish partnership that we talk about in Israel, it's not about, you know, we actually refuse the status quo, and it cannot be normalized. And the kind of partnership that we try to build is not something that exists. And the kind of space that we are building is a space that is only something that we are trying to expand and is limited. You know, we have systemic and aggressive discriminatory policies against Palestinians in Israel, which are intrinsically connected to the ongoing occupation and essentially state of apartheid in the West Bank. You know, expansions of settlements, settler tourism, the siege on Gaza, and the question of refugees, it's all so connected to the point that I think when I talk about Arab-Jewish partnership in Israel, I don't see another way to imagine a just solution without being able to succeed in humanizing my people to Jewish Israelis who at the moment are convinced that you know, maintaining the occupation is exactly what keeps them you know, secure. You know, Sami Abu Shhadi, which is a member of Knesset, you know, he always says we are agents. They expect us to be agents of condemnation. We are expected to defend our right for security and freedom by constantly condemning our resistance, you know, that can be violent. And I think James also mentioned that we do have violent resistance that can be, it's an immediate response to the more violent systemic, you know, oppression and colonization that is, you know, still active to this day. And, you know, while Israel maintains a monopoly over this violence. So I disagree with you, Congressman McGovern. I don't think, I agree with you with many things. I disagree with you regarding it. Some things are black and white. Some things, you know, there should be decisions about, especially in the US. It's not complex, you know, what's happening, and the support to Israel is not that complex. It really is not. Nothing justifies it other than economic interests, and that's something that you know, it's not gray. What is gray and what is complex are the humans, you know, the Palestinians and the Jewish Israelis and the Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza and you know, the refugees and everyone that was in this. And I think when we try to reimagine, you know, a lot of people don't think about us, you know, the two-state, one-state. It's very funny to me because people try to draw maps on something that's, you know, even before it, when it was possible, you know, we need to create a space that allows us, the people that actually live there, to reimagine the place that we want to be. And we're so far away from having that ability to imagine a just solution for everyone, which is exactly why we need to build this equal partnership, and we need to create this popular left, non-Zionist Palestinian Jewish left in Israel. I think I'm going to stop here, but I just really I think a lot of the times I'm very cautious because I don't want people it's very easy to get caught into the work that we do and the strategies that we do when we talk about it to outsiders. But it's not pretty. We cry on like weekly basis, discussing the struggles that we want to do and the posts that we want to, and the messages that we want to send. And we navigate through that through very painful experiences of hearing about a guy, a Palestinian being executed in Jerusalem, publicly, and another house demolition, and going to Walaji and going to Sheikh Jarrah, and like navigating that as a Palestinian through a lens of a socialist class struggle in Israel is extremely hard. But it's also the most essential thing that can be done. And I really hope that everyone that is listening to us right now can understand that. And I'm not saying this lightly, and I'm also not, I hope I can say it humbly, but I think standing together and just is probably one of the most important things happening. And I think absolutely that we need help internationally to put pressure on Israel to actually, not on Israel, to put pressure on the US to stop the aid and to put pressure on Israel to actually stop the deepening of the occupation. So thank you all so much. I hope, I'm sorry I get emotional, but I hope that I got my point of view, and it's such an honor to be here and to be able to speak.
Thanks, Sally. I would like to actually continue from the point you stopped at, and I want to say it in a very clear way. Also following what James said, which I find myself agree with almost everything you said. I want to say it in a very clear way. We think that yes, the support that the US gives Israel must be conditioned. It must be conditioned. It's not reasonable that whatever Israel does, whichever government is in power, the US will not be the US support for Israel will not be conditioned, and everything will go and everything will be okay and legitimate. We think there is a situation which we can call it by its name. It's an occupation over an entire people. It's an apartheid situation in the West Bank, where settlements and Jewish settlers can be going on one road which Palestinians are not allowed to, where the law applies to Jews and does not apply to the people that is living under the control of Israel. And we think that conditioning the aid of Israel and putting pressure on Israel is something positive, is something that may actually also draw your role as Americans, your role as a congressman, and your role as Americans to kind of ask yourself, how can you support the Palestinian people, but also supporting the Israeli people, because we do not benefit from this reality, and we also need real friends that will tell us, as you said, Congressman McGovern, we need friends that will tell us, sometimes you're drunk, sometimes you need to be criticized, sometimes we need to hear the harsh truth. But I also want to say that I try to picture and ask myself, what will happen if pressure will start coming from the US, from the US Congress, from American movements, telling Israel that the occupation must end and the Palestinian people deserves to be free, and also the Israeli society deserves to be free of being occupiers. I do not think this is enough. And that's my argument with you, James. I think conditioning the help, putting pressure on Israel, it's not enough to end the reality that we experience every day here in Palestine and Israel. And I think also when I try to ask myself, who will wake up tomorrow morning and put this pressure on Israel? Is it Bolsonaro in Brazil? Is it Modi in India? Is it Boris Johnson in the UK, or even President Biden in the US? I don't believe so. And I think even if we will see this pressure, and even if we think of past regimes that were boycotted or were pressured by other governments, there was always the actors, the agents on the ground that built the change and that worked to bring communities together and to organize people and mobilize them for justice. And I think that brings me to the role of why standing together is doing what it's doing and what we perceive as our role. We live in a society where everything is segregated. I'm a Jewish Israeli. Sally is a Arab Palestinian Israeli. It is not reasonable. The common sense in our society is that Sally should live her life completely separately from my life, and we will meet only in an unequal basis. It is also not reasonable. It's not imaginable in my society that Sally and me having the same values. Sally is a socialist. I'm a socialist. She believes in social justice. I believe in social justice. She's a feminist. I'm also a feminist. She believes in peace, and I also believe in peace. But it's not reasonable that she will put one ballot in the election and I will put the same ballot. Can you imagine this reality where people from different ethnicities cannot vote for the same Democratic Party in the US? For us, that's the reality. We vote separately, we live separately, we have different towns, and even if we live in one of the few shared cities in Israel, the neighborhoods will be separate, and parties and city councils will work against each other, and it will not be shared. And we come and we say, Jewish-Arab partnership is something possible. Jewish-Arab partnership is also the future, not coexistence. We don't believe in coexistence. We don't believe these people should live here and the others should live there and just coexist. We believe that the only key to progress forward and the only key to end injustices in our society is to create a shared interest kind of struggle and to portray the future as a future that we can all benefit from. Today, the future is gloomy. The future is dark for us. Palestinians will suffer from the future. They're suffering from the daily reality, but Israelis will also suffer from reality. There is this idea that one will win and one side will lose, but that's not the case. A minority will win and the majority will lose. So our politics, our Jewish-Arab partnership, the thing we're trying to do is to create, to build a majority around the shared interests of social justice, of equality, of an Israeli-Palestinian peace. Yes, to ask the question what is moral and what needs to be condemned, but also to do the hard groundwork, the daily work of bringing people together, of organizing people, of asking the question, what can we do with the resources, with the people we have around us in order to create change? It will take years, yes, but we need to build this hope, and this is our role on the ground. We cannot be satisfied with nations or I don't know, the UN or Congress just condemning Israel and saying, no, it's bad. We need to support the people on the ground, building hope, connecting people, bringing communities together, and trying to create the force on the ground that will be able to mobilize our societies into ending the occupation and bringing equality to everyone that lives on this land. So, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We've actually been getting lots and lots of questions. So what I think I'll do is I'll read some of those questions, and then we'll go back for a round of responses. And I'm going to try my best to group them together. There are a number of questions that have to do with really how do we shift the stasis, at least on the political front. And some comments were, I certainly agree that we must shift to a human rights paradigm on Israel-Palestine. Part of that requires supporting international law and international tribunals. Can you comment on the role for the International Criminal Court and accountability for Israel and Hamas for possible crimes against humanity and how that may affect the end goal of human rights and equality? Another question has to do with, is it possible to tie military diminishing or ending US military aid to Israel with the expansion of the settlements? Is that even possible? How do we move that forward? For those of us who believe that the only solution is one democratic state, does anyone have any suggestions about how to implement this? Professor David Mednikoff from UMass Amherst asked, what do panelists think specifically might push back against Israeli Hasbara industry success at demonizing pro-Palestinian discourse in the US and elsewhere? Do you think the recent move of the Middle East Studies Association of America to put forth a resolution voicing solidarity with the BDS movement will make any difference in this regard? Congressman McGovern, we have a question for you as well. You referenced George McGovern and his willingness to speak to people with disagreements. Given how different the political climate is today, where do you draw the line on what disagreements are acceptable? Would you sit down with noted Islamophobes and anti-Semites like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Louis Gohmert, who happen to be your colleagues? Where does one draw the line on these issues? So there's a number of various types of questions, and I thought I'd give you a chance to respond. I would also perhaps, Congressman McGovern, you mentioned the decision to criminalize these 6 Palestinian civil society organizations, and I was wondering as well if you could possibly comment if there's any updates or any sort of sense on potentially a pushback on that decision from the administration. Congressman McGovern, would you like to go?
Boy, those are a lot of questions. On a letter to Secretary Blinken, we have not heard back yet, but I expect we will. We've had some conversations with State Department officials as well as UN officials on that. And again, I believe that human rights organizations ought not to be criminalized, nor should they be labeled as terrorism. And again, I've seen no terrorists, and I've seen no evidence up to this point that would justify that. Again, I would like to think that there's an area of common ground, no matter where one's perspective is, on this issue. The question about where do I draw the line? Would I sit down with Louis Gohmert and Marjorie Taylor Greene? Unfortunately, I have to be in the same chamber as them. But I think that I think that there are people who are strongly pro-Israeli government, who have their strong points of view, who I would not equate as Marjorie Taylor Greene or Louis Gohmert. We could disagree with them, but I think those people need to be engaged. And I think maybe Jim Zogby's point is a good point about that. Maybe there needs to be a better job done of humanizing the conflict. We are, here in I say that all the time when it comes to some of the issues that we're working on in the United States, dealing with people who struggle in poverty. Where we're inundated with facts and figures and statistics, but you can't feel them. They're important to know, but it's not the same thing as hearing from somebody directly and hearing their reality. And I guess what I was trying to say, I'm not an expert on words like Noam Chomsky, but so sometimes my words don't always come out the right way. But I agree with what was said, essentially, that the human situation has to be the bottom line. And that's where we need to focus. And I think that's where, we can actually build a movement toward peace and toward justice. I think starting there is a better way to move the ball forward on a lot of the issues that people are talking about than beginning, by categorizing people into, very stark, characterizations. I just do. I mean, I've been at a lot of, and you have all too. So, I mean, you have been talking with more audiences than I have been on this issue. But depending on how you introduce this topic, you can lose somebody before you get to be able to humanize what the reality is. And I think in my congressional district, I could participate in a forum on this very topic with people with very sharply different perspectives, right? That would be much more in favor of what the Israeli government is now advocating. And that's just the reality here in the United States. What we need to do is figure out a way to see whether there is any common ground that we could where we could actually start building confidence, because I do believe essentially in the goodness of people. And I do believe that when people understand what the realities are in certain situations, that they will respond, hopefully in the right way. The final thing is we need a better strategy on the expansion of settlements, because it is unacceptable, and it is obliterating. I mean, again, and I even hate to go down this road, one state, two state, whatever. Everybody has their own opinions, but the bottom line is that it is making it much more difficult to get to a peaceful resolution of all that is going on right now in the region. And I know, and again, I appreciate the efforts of standing together and bringing Israelis and Palestinians together when Palestinians were forcibly displaced from their homes. I mean, I think that's, I think a lot of people paid attention to that and began to appreciate, one of the main injustices that was occurring against the Palestinian people. So there were a whole bunch of other questions that were answered, but I will let others go down that road. But again, thank you.
Thank you so much. Noam, I wanted to turn to you again. If you have follow-up thoughts, and you were mentioning really in your opening remarks about the occupation continues because the U.S. allows it to continue. But you see a shift in public opinion. But do you see a shift in the nature of the U.S.-Israeli relationship that has allowed this sort of U.S. support for Israeli policies to continue? I was wondering if you wanted to comment on that or any aspect of the discussion that you heard today.
Well, for the first time, we are now hearing in the United States openly, publicly, discussion of the idea that U.S. aid to Israel should be blocked for anything that goes to the occupied territories. That was unspeakable 5 or 10 years ago. It's now public. You can even read the proposal in columns in the New York Times. It's marginal, but you can talk about it. There is in fact a resolution in Congress. Betsy McCollum of Michigan introduced a resolution to cut off aid for anything involved in the occupied territories. These are moves, and a large part of the population in the United States increasingly would support them. As I mentioned, if you look at polls among liberal opinion, it's shifted substantially on these issues. Jim Zogby pointed out that it's a general fact about the way views on oppression and violence are being looked at by younger people. You couldn't have something like the 1619 project of the New York Times on 400 years of Afro-American violence and repression of Afro-Americans. Couldn't have had that a couple of years ago. So there are shifts. And in fact, I think a move to condition US aid to Israel, military or economic, on terminating, first of all, stopping the expansion of settlements, but that's only the beginning. It's not the expansion of settlements that's the problem, but rather their existence. The support for the settlements altogether should be blocked. And I think move in that direction is quite possible. Actually, a move on, we should recognize, first of all, that Israel is highly dependent on US support. When Israel made a decision in the 1970s to turn a very fateful explicit decision to reject political settlement in favor of expansion. In the 1970s, there was straightforward moves towards political settlement. I mentioned the Security Council resolution, which the US vetoed. Israel even refused to participate in the session. It was so passionately opposed to it. Well, happened to be a labor government at the time. Yitzhak Rabin was the prime minister who strongly denounced the proposal, said, we'll never negotiate with Palestinians on any issue. We can't have any discussion of this topic. Okay, made a choice. That choice had a consequence. One consequence is that Israel is highly dependent on US support. It's increasingly isolated internationally. It says tenuous support from Europe. In fact, it's gone so far that Israeli strategic analysts for some years have been pointing out that Israel might have to think about shifting its general policy orientation. Instead of alignment with the West, where there's concern, or at least voiced concern about human rights, international law, and so on, Israel should move towards closer alliance with states that just don't care about this. Singapore, China, Hungary's Orban, places where people aren't going to raise any questions about human rights violations. The Abraham Accords, which formalized tacit relations between US and Middle East dictatorships, are actually, I think, a step in this direction. Let's become part of an alliance, a reactionary alliance, where issues like human rights and international law just don't matter. Just interest, whatever's of common interest. We don't care about these things. Actually, my own feeling was that the Benny Gantz's analysis, attack on the 6 human rights groups was essentially a gesture in this direction. It was telling the West, we don't care about you. We know as well as you do that Al-Haq is not a terrorist organization. That's beyond ridiculous. But we don't care. We're just going to throw this in your face. And if you don't like it, too bad. We're simply moving in this direction. Well, Israel's moving in that direction. The other point is that Israel is compelled to follow US orders as it's become more and more of an international pariah state. It is more and more reliant on the United States. And we have seen this. Every president up to Obama, he was the first not to, every president prior to Obama made harsh demands on Israel, which they were compelled to accept, much as they didn't want to. So 1982, Reagan supported the US and the Israeli invasion of Lebanon until the point where it started to become embarrassing to the United States. By the end, when Israel was bombing West Beirut, it was becoming, and the US was supporting it, it was becoming an international embarrassment to the United States. And the US simply ordered Menachem Begin to call it off. It was a bitter blow to the Israeli government. The way Begin and his imagination was talking about having cornered Hitler in his bunker, and suddenly he's being told you can't go on. In fact, it destroyed Begin's career. Pulled out, of course, had to obey. Pulled out of politics. It was basically died shortly after. When you get to Clinton, Israel's economy is based very heavily on military export. And there's a huge market that they've been trying to enter, the Chinese market. China's perfectly willing. but the United States blocks it. Clinton ordered Israel to terminate its efforts to sell high-tech military equipment to China. Very reluctantly, Israel had to obey. George W. Bush, it went beyond that. It got to the point where Bush warned Israel that if it continued efforts to upgrade Chinese military equipment, the US would react very harshly. And in fact, Bush actually banned high US Israeli officials from visiting the United States, demanded not only that Israel terminate it, but it issue a public apology, which of course it did. It has no choice. The reliance on the United States is so extreme that if the United States issues orders, Israel will be very hard put not to accept them. Obama was actually the first president not to do this. It was quite remarkable what happened in the Obama administration. There was a Security Council resolution in February 2011, which called on Israel to observe official US policy. Official US policy was not to expand settlements, which is actually a secondary issue. It's the existence of the settlements that's the problem. When you tell Israel not to expand them, they can say yes and then work out other ways of expanding them. Talk about natural growth, this or that technique, and you can get around it. But Obama actually vetoed that Security Council resolution, a resolution which called on Israel to observe official US policy. Now, that one was so extreme that it even made the newspapers. They usually ignore US vetoes of Security Council resolutions, which happen all the time. Well, what put all this together, it means that if popular opinion in the United States moves in a public and organized way towards opposing the occupation and opposing US direct participation in the occupation, a combination of congressional action, pressure on the executive could very well lead to moves that Israel would have to adhere to put an end to this policy of systematic establishment of greater Israel and making a political solution hopeless. It's not reached that point yet, but it could. I think there are openings there. Let me just add a personal anecdote which may be helpful. Yesterday, I spent a good part of the morning, virtually, of course, talking to young people in Ireland, a young group, rather like yours, which is moving towards efforts towards reunification of the northern 6 Protestant counties with the Republic of Ireland. Well, right now that looks like a remote dream, but they're committed to it. And one of the things I talked about with them was my own experience in Northern Ireland in 1993. That was, if you recall, the peak of the violence. You couldn't park a car in Dublin and without opening the trunk to have it inspected by British soldiers to see if there's a bomb in it. I was giving talks in both the Catholic and Protestant areas of Belfast. Friends of mine on both sides, they couldn't go to the talk on the other side. It was just too dangerous. There was a war going on. Well, I did meet with a group of people in Belfast, which your group reminds me of. It was a group that was established by a Catholic human rights activist, which brought together people in Belfast from the Protestant and the Catholic community. And Jerry Adams was actually one of the people there. People were at swords points. They were killing each other, but they were talking, okay? You go back, I went back a couple of years later. Belfast is a unified city. There's conflict. You can see the conflict, but people are living together. There's interchange. They're not afraid to talk to each other. At the 1993, that looked like a hopeless dream. A couple of years later, it's in process, far from a dream. It's a reality that's being built. Well, right now, Irish unification looks like a dream, but it may not in a couple of years. It's greatly to the benefit of the population. They may overcome the conflicts and make that next step. And I think these are models to think about for Israel Palestine. What looks hopeless at one point may over time, through the kind of work that you're doing and that Americans can certainly help with, could become a reality that's understood. And it could lead to moves in the occupied territories, which would end the horrendous torture of Gaza and the constant torture of people living in the West Bank, and move towards one or another form of political settlement that can be imagined.
Amin.
Thank you. Thank you, Noam. Dr. Zogby, as we're running out of time, we have about 9 minutes for the end of this panel, but I think I'll give you the last word for some last thoughts of yours before we end today.
Well, let me just put together a couple of thoughts. I think that I am understanding, having done this, as the Congressman noted, for many decades now. I understand the politics of this and the problems involved in this. I do not expect, I mean, I can tell you stories. I went to Ron Dellum's back in the 70s and said, I need somebody who will defend these mayors, and you're the champion of human rights, and you're the champion in South Africa, you're the champion in the Philippines, you're the champion fighting for this. And he said, yeah, and if I do what you want me to do, I won't be in Congress anymore, and I won't be the champion of anything. Well, I didn't think that was true. Him coming from Berkeley, and he was a pretty safe congressman. But what I did know was that there was an asymmetry of power. The balance of power wasn't in the side of doing the right thing in this case. And there was public pressure. There was division then. Tom Harkin faced the same kind of thing when he supported us on 2 mayors that we wanted to defend. And so the burden at this point, while Congress has to act, the burden is not on Congress. Congress is the end product of where public opinion is, and where the public opinion organized in politics is. We have to change that from the ground up. We have to create more political pressure so that more members of Congress can do the right thing. Being able to have a Rashida in Congress, and an Ilhan in Congress, and a Betty McCollum in Congress, and a Jim McGovern in Congress, and a Jamal Bowman in Congress, and people who are moving clearly in the right direction on this, they need to be, their voices need to be amplified by more voices like that. We need to beat more people who aren't good on this, and make it clear that this is an issue you can win on. You can win on justice for Palestinians. It's not a losing issue. Democratic Majority for Israel spent $2 million in ads defaming Jamal Bowman. He beat him. They spent lots of bucks trying to hurt Ilhan. She beat him. Betty McCollum won. Cori Bush won. This is not a losing proposition. In some districts, yeah, but in most districts, no. But it is a pain in the ass for a congressman to do the right thing. I mean, a congressman or woman will face a lot of heat. Our job is to change that dynamic and create more pressure on this side than exists on the other side. That means taking, not just raising consciousness, but raising consciousness and organizing it politically to make real change if we want it to happen. And what I believe is that we will reach a breaking point, a tipping point, if you will. Maybe that's the better expression. I remember when Pete McCloskey won in Congress, Marine Colonel running as a Republican against Shirley Temple, the former actress, right? Who was pro-war. Pete McCloskey was a Marine colonel who was anti-war, and he won. And the mood here, when I talked to Pete about it at one point, he said the mood when I got to Washington was sort of like, you remember the book Siddhartha? When he was sheltered from all kinds of suffering in his life, and then he goes out in the world and he sees an old man and a sick man, and he says, oh my God, could that happen to me? And it was sort of change in consciousness. He said, I came to Washington and people were saying, oh my God, he won on that. Maybe it could happen to me. And there was a change in thinking. I think that that's what we have to do to create the change in thinking, so that people in Congress, people who are running for Congress, say, this is a winner, not a loser. We can actually run on this one with a clear voice and do well with it. And in that context, look, I was Jesse Jackson's deputy campaign manager, worked with Bernie Sanders. I'm clearly on the left in so many different ways. And I've got friends further to the left who say, how dare you defend J Street? No, I'm in the, if I'm left enough to quote Mao, I'll say, let 1,000 flowers bloom. I appreciate J Street. They've created openings. They've made possible a debate that didn't exist before. I am to the left of J Street, but I appreciate the opening they've created for Ben the Ark and Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now and other groups that have taken advantage of the opening and broadened it even further. They've made it possible for Arab Americans to have a debate. 20 years ago, I'd go before Congress and get the crap kicked out of me. That doesn't happen anymore. We're in a different world here. And so, I appreciate the fact that we've got partners who are moving slowly, maybe too slowly in some cases, but the movement is growing and the movement is getting stronger. We have to organize that into a political force to win some elections. The more we win, the more voices get heard, and the greater the possibility that there will be change, there will be conditions placed on aid. And one of the first places to start, I go back to my initial point, is by telling stories. People need to know that Palestinians matter. It's not about Mahmoud Abbas and Hamas and all that. This is about the farmer who lost his land. This is about the guy who's going to be thrown out of his ancestral home. This is about the people who are living in the shadow of a settlement that is expanding and has extremist settlers who are torching their crops. This is about the people who are held in detention without charge. Almost 500 of them at a regular clip. This is about the kids who grow up in a totally warped environment in Gaza, where they're playing in cesspools because the water's in the street, because Israel, why, when they bomb Gaza, why do they bomb the sewage system? Why do they bomb water treatment plants? Why do they bomb the electric power grid? I mean, it is criminal and cruel. Those are the stories we got to tell. And as we change the consciousness, we have to organize that consciousness into politics, win elections. So that's the beginning of the process. The end of it is we then go to Congress and say, hey, there's enough of you guys, let's do something. We don't start with Congress, we end with Congress. And I just thought I'd make that final point. And I appreciate you guys very much, Alon-lee and Sally, what you do, Omar and Bob for putting this together. Noam, I revere you. What can I say? I was reflecting on the fact that when I started the Palestine Human Rights Campaign in the 70s, you and Richard Falk and a few others were some of our early champions, and I appreciate that. Edward Said brought you on board. And Congressman McGovern, you really are a champion for human rights, and I appreciate that. And I appreciated your wise counsel when I was on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. You were great to work with. Thank you all very much. I left in the chat box my email. If anybody has a question I didn't get to, please write to me directly. I'll respond. I so love this conversation. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Zogby, and thank you. You took the words out of my mouth in terms of thanking everyone, and I echo those words. I think the fact that this conversation happened is a sign of progress, of shifting discussions, necessary discussions that have to take place. So I really appreciate the very inspiring and very honest comments that you all shared. Thank you, Congressman. Sally and Alon-lee, thank you so much. Dr. Zogby, and of course, Noam, thank you as always so much for all your work. Good night, everyone, and thank you for joining as well.
Thank you very much, Omar, also, and thank you all for joining.
What an honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for everyone listening for 2 hours. Wow. Thank you. A pleasure to
Bye.
meet you, James.
Bye.
And Omar and Noam, seeing you again.
Great to be with you.
Have a wonderful evening.
Bye-bye, Noam.
Bye-bye.
Free Palestine.